Testing. Do you have your earpiece in? Okay, testing. 1, 2, 1, 2. Sound check for the court reporter. Audio check. Testing, testing. 1, 2. Sound check.
Testing, testing. Hello, hello.
Mic check, 1, 2, 1, 2, mic check.
Sure. You can read it for me. Just cross out the things I said about you.
You know exactly what we're all going to say, so I'm okay with that.
Yeah, this isn't going to be that dramatic. Maybe the questions. I doubt it. So are you going first or last? Or are we not in that order?
Good.
Oh, okay. Maybe they just got us mixed up. So have you done an analysis or study on the Appliance program?
I have, yeah, I've done several. I've commented on it.
I'll be very honest. I did read the email.
Maybe we will
Consumer
overnight perspective.
But then also I've done my
Probably in
I think maybe, but
analysis
no.
of different assumptions in these analysis. And what does that mean to them? That's
Edema,
Yeah.
please. Thank you. After.
Ends up making a difference, though, doesn't it?
oh my
I'm
gosh.
sure I'm not, definitely sure I'm not going back to the office today.
This is what, your third this year?
You might afford it, but I
I'm
just took a
not
sip out of it. So let's get you another one.
Hearings in this committee this week. I'm not an expert on
How about I
all
say this session? Is that better?
Yes.
I'm actually impressed that they got some numbers Friday morning.
Unless
A few.
Well,
As a matter of
noticed
fact,
that. You guys should
our,
everybody come.
our lawyer, Chuck Samuels, and myself were
Pallone will, Mr.
very
Mr.
active
There's
in
Peter,
the
yeah.
coalition back in the
Mark right
80s.
there.
Mr.
In
Rush.
that kind of makeup.
Yeah, I see.
I actually led the lobbying coalition. At that time, I was working for the refrigeration.
Santa Rob.
So we've been through many, many iterations of the law, many, many rulemakings, way back.
The North Carolina congressman may ask you about dishwashers. He says it is manual, says you're supposed to run the hot water before you start the dishwasher. Wants to know if the test feature takes it into account. I don't think that it does. Check it out. He's on our side. He was struck that he claims that the dishwasher used to check guys that you're supposed to run the hot water first. I've actually never heard it.
Nor have I. But the test procedure, I think the funky thing about the test procedure is whether it has a heated drying on during the test. But it doesn't require you run the hot water.
I don't
first,
think so.
second.
But I mean, you can just tell.
Yeah.
So basically, it's going to be supportive of this.
Yeah.
Supportive.
Okay. I love those.
Yeah.
Okay. So, where might the other side of the aisle be today? Are the mics on? No, they're not.
I want to thank the witnesses for being here at 9:30. You know, we'll get started at 9:30. We're just waiting for our friends on the other side of the aisle. And there he comes right now. I'm enjoying my hot chocolate. I'm sorry you all don't have any, but. I'd like to call the hearing to order this morning, and I want to thank our panel of witnesses for being with us. I'm going to introduce you right before you give your opening statement, so I'll just introduce you individually at that time. I'd like to recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. Today's hearing is entitled Home Appliance Energy Efficiency Standards. Since 1987, we've had energy efficiency standards for certain appliances. It came about because back in 1975, there was a Federal Energy Policy Act that established that format. The Reagan administration was sued because it was not being implemented. And as a result of that lawsuit, we've now found ourselves in about the 5th or 6th gyration of these energy efficiency standards, which apply to almost anything that plugs into the wall in your home, whether it's an air conditioner, refrigerator, washer, dryer, furnace, oven, dishwasher, water heater, lighting, whatever it might be. And the argument was initially that you would save energy bills over time because of the efficiency. You'd use less electricity, and the small amount of additional cost, you would end up saving money. Now, some people today are questioning that because as I said, we're about the 5th, 6th, or 7th round of these efficiency standards, and some people say that you reach a point of diminishing returns. And some people say that the additional cost now is at such a rate that you really don't have any savings over the long term because the energy efficiencies are simply not that great. Now, other people say that's not the case. And of course, additionally now, everybody's talking about global warming. And so there's additional emphasis being placed on this because of that. One of the problems that we have is in America, we feel like we're doing more than any other country in the world on these types of issues. I was reading an article the other day that said there are 3 billion people in the world who use open flames to cook today. And in the developing world, by 2040, they expect that 65% of energy consumption will come from the developing world. We also hear a lot today about people being concerned about the cost of living. And we know that in California and New York, they're trying to raise the minimum wage, and many people are urging that we raise the minimum wage. Some people agree with that, and some people don't. But it's interesting that those strong advocates for raising the minimum wage, they don't want to consider the additional cost caused by regulations. And it's one thing to say, okay, we need to raise the minimum wage, but to low-income, middle-class family, if these appliances are going to cost additional money, what does that mean to their pocketbook? And then we're even hearing now from some of the appliance makers that some of these new appliances really don't work as well as the old ones. And so it's a situation where I think no one really expected that the Department of Energy and this administration would be as aggressive as they have been on so many different fronts. Now, the good news was that in 1975, when they were considering these efficiency standards, they were supposed to consider that the technology was really feasible and that there was an economic justification for it. But today, that's beginning to be blurred, and we know certainly at EPA, when they certainly don't consider whether it's technologically feasible or economically justified. So if we wanted to have a more balanced approach, what we're trying to do is hear from people who are involved in this on a daily basis, because the American public, when they go to the appliance store to buy an appliance, they don't understand all about this efficiency. They just know what the price is, and then some people are telling them, well, you're going to save money, even though it's a lot more because of electricity will go down, and other people make the other arguments. So one of our objectives today is to just try to get a better understanding of what is the reality of this. And that's why we're here. So I want to thank all of you for joining us. And this time I'd like to introduce the distinguished gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Rush, for his opening statement.
I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding today's hearing on the home appliance energy efficiency standards under the Department of Energy, a stakeholder's perspective. And I want to welcome, Mr. Chairman, all of our witnesses before the subcommittee here today. Mr. Chairman, since there are DOE standards that we're addressing here today, I think that it would definitely benefit the members of the subcommittee to also hear from the agency directly. And I hope that we can invite them to testify on this issue at a near date in the near future. Mr. Chairman, historically, energy efficiency has proven to be the low-hanging fruit that has brought both parties together legislatively, while also making our country safer, more secure, and more attentive to the impacts of climate change. Indeed, the story of energy efficiency, Mr. Chairman, is one that is filled with success stories that have really helped propel our country forward by making us more independent and more secure, while also reducing the cost of energy, both in our pocketbooks and its impact to our environment. In fact, Mr. Chairman, by DOE's own estimation, American families saved close to $63 billion as a result of their energy bills going down, and this is a result of these appliance standards that we are considering just in the year 2015 alone. The agency also forecasts, Mr. Chairman, that standards issued since 2009 will save the American consumer over $53 billion in utility costs and decrease carbon emissions by 2.3 billion metric tons by the year 2030. Mr. Chairman, in addition to the huge energy savings and the benefits to the environment, appliance and equipment standards also lead to additional investments in the workforce and the ultimate creation of jobs. A 2011 report by the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy entitled, and I quote, "Appliance and Equipment Efficiency Standards, a Money Maker and a Job Creator," end of quote, found that the efficiency standards led to net job creation in every single state. The study also found that by 2020, appliance and equipment standards will contribute up to 387,000 annual jobs to the U.S. economy. Mr. Chairman, while almost every effort by DOE to establish or revise energy efficiency standards has been met with some type of opposition, traditionally this issue has been pursued in what I would commend both sides of this subcommittee on. They've been pursued in a bipartisan manner, with contributions to the party put forward by our presidents and by past Congresses, even though those Congresses and the White House had been under the control of both Republicans and Democrats. It is my hope, Mr. Chairman, that following today's hearing, we will ultimately get back to that type of collaboration and that type of cooperation on this issue. Mr. Chairman, it is critically important that the federal government maintains its leadership role of promoting, encouraging, and enticing interested stakeholders to continue with the progress that has already been made in efficiency technologies, so that we can continue to keep moving the nation's energy policy forward. Mr. Chairman, I want to end by saying I look forward to today's hearing. I look forward to our expert witnesses on the successes and the challenges that are facing this nation as it relates to energy efficiency appliance. And with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. This time I recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome. It's important to hear from stakeholders because the stories that we weave here may not always really reflect the real world, and we're hoping that you will give us what's going on the ground. And so I'm going to weave a little story to put this on perspective too. Congressman Boston and I met with a small manufacturer about 2 months ago, and they're subject to a DOE enforcement case. And of course, because of the enforcement case, they've been told to stop selling a piece of equipment. This company spent several months trying to find out why a third-party lab that tested the product, why they met the standard, and why when DOE got their hands on it, they didn't meet the standard. And DOE tested the product 7 months later, and not only, and I'll read the story of why DOE came to a different conclusion, but it is also under a new regulation than when the product was originally produced. So here's this Freudian catch-22 world in which you all have to try to live in, to try to catch up after a product has been manufactured to a new regulation and then face the heavy hand of the federal government. So the company was not aware of Section 2.11 because it was not included in the proposed rulemaking. It was 2 lines in a large rule previously represented as not materially altering efficiency measures. This piece of equipment did not pass the automatic test, but it did pass the manual test. So this is a piece of equipment that you operate manually, or you can hook up a thermostat and it'll operate automatically. It did meet the standards for the manual test. It didn't meet the test for the automatic. DOE would never tell them why they failed the test until months later. Even when they asked for transparency, show us your work, tell us what you're doing. So this is a crazy world in which we live in. The federal government's there to help, not punish. Federal government's there to, if they want to have efficiency and they want to encourage movement forward, they should be incenting. They should not. So this small company, it's a small company, has a proposed $241,000 penalty because DOE is now saying that they knowingly kind of jimmied the efficiency standards where the equipment met the manual standard, didn't meet the automatic standard. Of course, when you fall into this regime, you can't sell your product. It's banned from being sold until this conflict gets resolved. Small companies just can't survive this type of work. It would be best, as we hear, I'm sure, similar stories about the struggles of maintaining it. Businesses' goal is they have to raise capital, assume risk, hoping to get a return. And while they're doing that, they create jobs. If the government, we just want the government to be fair players in this system. If we're gonna create these new standards, give industry a chance to meet them. And don't play games of delay by not working with the industry and telling them why they failed to meet the standard, or changing the rules for automatic or manual type systems. So I'm really looking forward to the hearing. I think it's very, very important, and I've got questions when we come to it to address the jobs debate, which I think people will find pretty problematic, that these are now causing the loss of jobs in our country. And I yield back my time.
The gentleman yields back. This time recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Appliance and Equipment Efficiency Standards program at the Department of Energy has been incredibly successful over the years in reducing energy consumption and lowering consumers' energy bills. The program has also been beneficial to manufacturers, making energy-saving products more ubiquitous and leaving the playing field, leveling, I should say, the playing field nationally. In fact, efficiency standards for consumer appliances and other products likely constitute the single most effective federal effort to reduce energy consumption in the United States. According to the Energy Department, Americans saved $63 billion on their utility bills last year because of these standards. And this has also resulted in avoiding 2.6 billion tons of carbon dioxide emissions, which would equal the annual level of emissions from roughly 543 million vehicles. These figures are staggering and highlight the dual benefits of this important program. Consumers save money, and our environment is spared billions of tons of pollution every year. And all of this began with enactment of the Energy Policy and Conservation Act, EPCA, which was signed into law by Republican President Gerald Ford. I highlight Republican. This apparently started a trend because, with the exception of an amendment to the statute directing DOE to establish efficiency standards for consumer products under the Carter administration, every major expansion of the Appliance Efficiency Standards program has been signed into law by a Republican president. So while some of our witnesses and my colleagues on the other side of the aisle may lament the long list of appliance standards proposed by the Obama administration, they should remember that, depending on your point of view, much of the credit or blame for the Obama standards can be traced back to two laws signed by President George W. Bush, the Energy Policy Act of 2005 and the Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007. And while the 2007 Act was passed by a Democratic Congress, the Energy Policy Act of 2005 was born out of a fully Republican Congress and authored by the former Republican chairman of this committee. I don't know why I have to keep saying fully Republican Congress. That's obviously not what I like, but the fact of the matter is that that most of this legislation was done by Republican Congress and presidents. And this underscores an important fact. For the past 40 years, energy efficiency has been a bipartisan issue where Republicans and Democrats have come together to reduce energy consumption and save consumers money. Times have changed, obviously. Certainly there are a few Republicans who still understand the importance of energy efficiency. Mr. McKinley has worked with Mr. Welch to demonstrate that bipartisanship in this area is still alive to some degree. Yet, regrettably, that seems to be the only Republican support for major efficiency legislation in this Congress. Consider the recent House vote to go to conference on an energy package that would actually increase consumption by rolling back efficiency. Again, how times have changed. Could the efficiency standard setting process use improvement? Of course it could, because there's always room for improvement. Despite a revisionist view that disputes over efficiency standards are a new development, the fact is that the standard setting process has always yielded some controversy from one industry participant or another. But these controversies were generally worked out, and the results were better products, more efficiency, and often useful changes to the standard setting process. My concern is that improvements simply may not be possible in this current Congress. Last year, when we were working to forge a bipartisan compromise on furnace standards, the less than forthright positions taken by certain stakeholders made me question the sincerity of the so-called reform efforts. Perhaps it's just a matter of perspective. What some stakeholders view as minor tweaks look an awful lot to me like a thorough gutting of the standards program. So ultimately, I believe a serious, successful energy policy for our nation must address demand, not just supply. Improving the use of the resources we have to get more from less is common sense, and that's why efficiency has traditionally been a concept that brought parties together. And Mr. Chairman, I just hope that one day we'll see that again. It doesn't seem like today is the day. So thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back, and that concludes the opening statements on our side. So at this time, our first witness will be Ms. Sophie Miller, who is a senior policy analyst at the George Washington University Regulatory Studies Center. So Ms. Miller, thanks for being with us, and you'll be given 5 minutes, and just make sure the microphone is on and it's up close to you so we can hear every single word that you say. And you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Chairman Whitfield, Ranking Member Rush, and members of the subcommittee for inviting me to share my expertise today. I appreciate the subcommittee's interest in the Department of Energy's Energy Conservation Program, as well as opportunities for Congress to improve it. I am the Senior Policy Analyst at the George Washington University Regulatory Studies Center, where I analyze the effects of regulation on public welfare, including the effects of DOE's energy efficiency standards on consumers specifically. Through my research, I've identified ways in which these standards can harm consumers rather than benefiting them by limiting the products available and removing from the market appliances that might best suit their needs. DOE's energy efficiency standards regulate appliances used in most households, such as dishwashers, air conditioners, and refrigerators, and as a result, they affect almost all U.S. consumers. These standards increase the prices of common appliances in exchange for reducing consumers' energy and water bills in the future. While DOE does estimate that consumers receive large net benefits from this trade-off, it does not take into account the diversity of Americans or that U.S. households have very different needs and preferences when it comes to household appliances. As a result, one-size-fits-all energy efficiency standards can deprive consumers of the ability to make purchases that best suit their circumstances and constraints. And in such cases, these regulations are a cost to consumers rather than a benefit. For example, efficient dishwashers or clothes dryers save consumers more money in the long term the more frequently they are used, and tend not to benefit households with lower frequency of use, which includes couples or single residents such as the elderly. In proposing energy efficiency standards for clothes washers, DOE calculated large benefits by estimating that a household operates its clothes washer 392 times per year, or more than once a day on average. And while this might be realistic for large families or households with small children, it does not represent every household. In fact, even after accounting for their lower energy bills, the standards ended up costing the nearly 70% of American households that used clothes washers less frequently than 6 times per week. And to illustrate from personal experience, a very efficient dishwasher made sense for my mother, who has 9 children, and used to run the dishwasher as much as 4 times per day, if you can imagine that. But my current household of 2, we run the dishwasher twice a week, and in our case, it's not likely that a more efficient and more expensive appliance is going to be worth the investment. In addition, efficiency standards are particularly costly for low-income households. Whether wealthier Americans can afford to wait years or even decades to recoup the higher costs of an efficient appliance, while poor Americans with less certain streams of income have higher opportunity costs. DOE calculates high benefits by using a relatively low time value of money, which field studies find represents wealthier households. Changing DOE's model to reflect the actual time value of money to low and median income households shows that they encourage large net costs as a result of efficiency standards. When a paycheck has to cover rent, food, and other necessities, a very efficient appliance may not be affordable, even if it does reduce electric bills in the future. Many families simply cannot borrow at the 3% rates that DOE assumes. But energy cost savings are not the only justification for these standards, as we've heard, as more efficient appliances can also reduce environmental emissions. But these environmental benefits are typically quite small relative to the cost of the standards. In fact, the costs outweigh these benefits by a factor of 3 to 1. By looking at environmental benefits alone, DOE would not be able to justify the standards that it has set for most appliances. In sum, the payoff from more efficient appliances will vary depending on a household's income, size, and other characteristics such as geographic location. It is perfectly rational for individual households to prefer to purchase different appliances, including those that do not meet DOE's standards. By taking away those choices and preventing households from buying the appliance that best suits their individual needs, DOE is imposing a cost on consumers and not a benefit. This is particularly true for low and median income Americans and the elderly, who bear the highest costs of appliance efficiency standards. Thank you all for your time. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Miller, very much for your opening statement. And our next witness this morning is Mr. Joseph McGuire, who's the President and CEO of the Association of Home Appliance Manufacturers. Thanks for being with us, and you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Whitfield, Ranking Member.
And turn your microphone on and get it close.
Okay. Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Rush and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify this morning. AHAM's membership includes more than 150 companies throughout the world and employs tens of thousands of people in the United States. Our members produce more than 95% of the household appliances shipped for sale in this country. I don't think there's any disagreement at this table that the appliance standards and Energy Star programs have been successful. Energy efficiency gains across core major appliance categories are dramatic and undeniable. For example, the most commonly purchased modern refrigerator uses the same amount of electricity as a 50-watt light bulb. A new clothes washer uses 73% less energy than it did in 1990 and half the water. I also want to make very clear that our industry has been a strong supporter of these programs and has been involved in numerous rulemakings and legislative solutions to strengthen and improve the programs. In 1987, I personally led the 200-plus organizations that initiated and supported the National Appliance Energy Conservation Act. We strongly support a system of federal standards and state preemption, and we do not propose a rollback of any standards. But while these programs are both successful, they are both in need of modernization to recognize the success achieved and to establish a framework for policies and programs focused on meaningful additional efficiency gains. Yes, there should still be federal standards that guarantee energy savings nationwide, but absent technological breakthroughs, a process geared towards continually ratcheting up efficiency standards, particularly for products that have already been subject to multiple revisions, does not make sense for the environment, the consumer, or the economy. But this will not happen under the current standards construct. Reform legislation is needed. H.R. 8 is a practical step along that path, offering modest, sensible changes to EPCA that will essentially require DOE to follow the regulatory procedures it had agreed to with the very organizations that advocated for EPCA reform in 1987. But more is needed. Today, AHAM is calling on Congress to take further steps to modernize our national energy efficiency law by ending mandatory serial rulemaking and permitting amended standards only when justified by quantifiable metrics, including a list of covered products for which no further rulemaking is needed, absent technological game changers. requiring DOE to meaningfully consider cumulative regulatory burden on product manufacturers, mandating procedures regarding transparency and public engagement, no more black box analyses, applying the Administrative Procedure Act to the Energy Star program. There have been more than 30 standards and amendments that apply to the AM products under the program, and there have also been numerous test procedure revisions accompanying these standards. The reality is, though, that for many product categories, the relentless march of sequential rulemakings is not justified. That is because opportunities for additional energy savings beyond those already achieved are severely diminished as products are nearing maximum efficiency under technology. Further standards are likely to increase costs to consumers and manufacturers beyond an acceptable level, and for some products, reduced energy use will likely result in degraded performance and functionality. We saw this in the flawed proposed dishwasher rule last year, whose consumer payback period exceeded the product's life and resulted in products that could not clean dishes. DOE, to its credit, retracted the proposal, but it shouldn't take a national uproar for this to happen. The rule never should have been proposed. As for Energy Star, the program has drifted from its original mission of energy efficiency into other areas beyond its expertise and authority. This drift must be considered in concert with the reality that the success of the program has essentially made it mandatory in the marketplace. Congress needs to bring this program under the much more traditional procedures and specific criteria of the Administrative Procedures Act, which applies to virtually every other program EPA administers. It is also important that Congress make clear that Energy Star is about energy efficiency only, not about EPA's ideas regarding quality, functionality, sustainability, other non-energy factors. Our ultimate objective is to improve the U.S. regulatory environment in measurable ways that foster a fairer, more predictable, more open, and more efficient regulatory landscape. As an industry, we will continue to live up to our responsibility to provide consumers with life-enhancing products that deliver superior performance in energy and environmental benefits. Our industry is very competitive, which drives not only innovation, but also reduced product costs through hundreds of millions of dollars in productivity improvements. That is why home appliance prices don't keep up with the CPI, not because of appliance standards. Productivity investments hide the fact that changing product design and materials to meet energy standards adds costs, implying that the huge efforts in time and capital investments to achieve productivity somehow make energy efficiency free is a great misunderstanding. Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee, in summary, we call on Congress to modernize EPCA so that it addresses current circumstances by recognizing the diminishing energy savings opportunities for many products, evaluating cumulative regulatory burden and the actual impact of past rules, and improving transparency and stakeholder engagement. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. McGuire. And our next witness is Ms. Elizabeth Noll, who is the Legislative Director for Energy and Transportation at the Natural Resources Defense Council. Ms. Noll, thanks for being with us, and you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning. Mr. Chairman, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to share the perspective of the Natural Resources Defense Council on national energy efficiency standards set by the Department of Energy for many household appliances and commercial products. This program sets dependable minimum levels of energy efficiency that all Americans can count on to reduce their utility bills, the carbon pollution that harms human health, while promoting innovation and new job opportunities. My name is Elizabeth Noll, and I'm the Legislative Director for the Energy and Transportation Program at NRDC. NRDC has long supported energy efficiency standards, and we're far from alone. We've successfully worked alongside many groups, including NEMA, AHRI, and AHAM here today. And support was reiterated in a recent op-ed we authored with the National Association of Manufacturers. And let's not forget, the initial law establishing standards was signed by President Ronald Reagan, then expanded and improved with broad bipartisan support in laws signed by both Presidents George H.W. and W. Bush. And why is there such strong support for efficiency standards? This program is wildly successful, delivering tremendous consumer and national benefits. It has broad and bipartisan support, founded on a long history of collaboration and consensus building. And by all accounts, there is still huge potential for even more energy and financial savings now and in the future. To my first point, by every single measure, the program provides huge benefits. In fact, national appliance standards are the second biggest energy-saving policy in U.S. history, second only to vehicle fuel economy standards. Appliance standards are saving the typical U.S. household about $500 per year on their utility bills. Last year alone, American consumers saved $63 billion. And thanks to standards already on the books today, consumers and benefits will save almost $2 trillion on their energy bill due to improved appliance and equipment sold through 2035. Because these standards are cutting American energy consumption, it also reduces the need to burn polluting fossil fuels to run those appliances and equipment. Last year alone, national appliance standards helped the U.S. avoid emissions of 300 million tons of carbon dioxide. That's equivalent to the annual pollution from about 63 million cars. As I noted earlier, 3 Republican presidents have signed laws supporting energy efficiency standards. And for the first time since the early 90s, the Department of Energy is up to date with its legal deadlines that Congress enacted. In the spirit of consensus building and collaboration, the agency has done more than ever to open up avenues to increase stakeholder participation and collaboration. Of the 42 standards finalized since 2009, almost a quarter stemmed from consensus agreements negotiated with industry support. And those that aren't negotiated go through a normal rulemaking process, which includes multiple opportunities for input from industry. As a result, the vast majority of American energy efficiency standards go into effect without controversy. As noted in other testimony today, manufacturers much prefer a single national standard over a state-by-state patchwork of requirements. Consumer groups, state governments, business groups, utilities, all have engaged constructively and support the program. One might ask, are there more energy, consumer, and environmental savings to be achieved? Emphatically, yes. One example involves the biggest energy and pollution saver from a single standard in the agency's history, which was completed in January for commercial rooftop air conditioners, heat pumps, and warm air furnaces. And it represents the 3rd revision to this standard. This standard is expected to save 15 quadrillion BTUs of energy over a 30-year period, which is nearly equivalent to the amount of energy and all of the coal burned to generate electricity in the United States in 1 year. A forthcoming report by the Appliance Standards Awareness Project and the American Council for an Energy Efficiency Economy finds that the savings potential for federal standards that will be eligible for update within the next 8 years exceeds what has been accomplished over the last 8. And innovation by our leading manufacturers is likely to open up new opportunities for savings that we cannot even contemplate today. Without standards, cost-effective energy efficiency opportunities will be lost, leading to unnecessarily high energy bills, increased energy consumption, more harmful pollution, and uncertainty for manufacturers. There's no doubt that this program works and will continue to deliver huge consumer and environmental value now and into the future. Thank you for the opportunity to share my views, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Noll, for your statement. At this time, I'd like to introduce Mr. Kevin Cosgriff, who is the President and CEO of the National Electrical Manufacturers Association, and thanks for being with us, and you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Rush, and members of the subcommittee for having us today. I'm the President and CEO of the National Electrical Manufacturers Association, some nearly 400 members that provide virtually everything in the electrical world. I appreciate this opportunity to talk about EPCA with the subcommittee. We have a central position in this dialogue, given that 20 of the 63 covered products are made by NEMA members, and an additional 30 covered products contain components made by NEMA members. I have 3 main points that I'd like to make today. First, as has been stated, there are diminishing energy savings returns to multiple rulemakings on the same product. That's not saying that we don't believe in energy savings. We're just saying there's diminishing returns on multiple rulemakings that ought to be considered. Future energy efficiency opportunities should include looking at energy use systems, not simply components or individual products. And lastly, serial regulation does over time limit consumer choice. First, on diminishing returns, EPCO was written 40 years ago, and many of the covered products have since achieved then unimagined levels of efficiency. Several products have been through 2 or more different rulemakings, and the EPCA statute requires the DOE to determine whether higher standards are warranted on every single covered product at least every 6 years. This applies even to products that have already reached the stage of regulatory maturity, as it were. That is to say, the products for which cost-effective efficiency improvements have essentially reached their limits. Cost-effective energy improvements have reached their limits. There are 2 components to this situation we believe warrant congressional attention. We should retire several of the mature covered products, and by that I mean retire at the current level of efficiency, not backslide, and that stakeholders, including government, should be given sufficient time to analyze the impact of a previous regulation before a new rulemaking cycle kicks off. Barely has a product entered the market before the next rule process kicks off. There has not been enough time to really analyze the information in the real world to see if it works. My second point is that energy efficiency opportunities should begin looking at energy use systems. EPCO was crafted for individual products. The challenge ahead, I think, is to build on this past industry success with a new, more holistic approach to these savings opportunities. Individual products are increasingly interconnected and operate as a system rather than singularly. We suggest Congress consider this opportunity when discussing energy savings. Think energy savings from a building versus energy savings from a lamp. Demands from, my third point is serial regulation impacts consumer choice. Demands from global competition, government regulation, and the all-important consumer preference require manufacturers to sprint to remain competitive. While our members are accustomed and good at running this race, an endless regulatory environment erects hurdles that they must repeatedly clear each and every time to remain viable. They're the definition of having skin in the game. One tendency of EPCA, however, is that over time it'll trend towards eliminating certain products from the market. Under this type of regulatory scheme, there'll be fewer and fewer choices offered to consumers. We assert that markets should drive, and in fact are driving, the energy-efficient economy. One choice that markets can do without, however, is availability of products entering the United States that do not comply with U.S. law and policy. This deprives consumers of energy-efficient benefits and disadvantages law-abiding manufacturers. This is an area where the federal government especially could be helpful with policing up these imports. In conclusion, electrical manufacturers' contribution to the energy efficiency economy has been diligent and I believe commendable. Throughout this effort, NEMA has made constructive proposals to Congress, to DOE, and working with other stakeholders to advance energy efficiency where we believed it was justified and where the savings were significant. We've resisted regulation for the sake of simply doing something more when the benefits were insignificant or the costs were just too high. The 40-year-old model of regulating energy use and single products has in many cases done its duty, but its diminishing returns are exacting an increasing cost for our industry and higher price for our consumers. A legislative overhaul that builds on the success of the last 40 years but allows us to all keep the energy efficiency economy moving forward is what we wish to support. We urge Congress to seize this unique opportunity. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Cosgriff. At this time, our next witness is Mr. Thomas Ekman, who is the Director of the Power Division of the Northwest Power and Conservation Council. Thanks for being with us, and you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Minority Leader Rush. My name is Tom Ekman. I am the Director of Power Planning for the Northwest Power and Conservation Council. I'll start with a very quick thumbnail of who we are, so since there are no Northwest delegates here, I thought it might be important to figure out why I'm here representing the Northwest. The Northwest Power and Conservation Council was established under a congressional authorization under the Northwest Power and Conservation Act of 1980, Public Law 96501. We are an interstate compact authorized by you folks here in Congress to do power planning for the Northwest. So we, for the states of Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and western Montana, we produce a 20-year power forecast of future needs and a resource plan to meet those needs for electricity. And our statutory requirement is that we're to treat energy efficiency as one of the resources we can rely on to meet those needs. Over the past 3 decades, 35 years, we produced 7 different power plans. We're to update those plans every 5 years, so we started back in 1982 with the first plan and called for cost-effective energy efficiency to be a major component of that planning process as directed by Congress. Over that past 35 years, energy efficiency has been a very significant contributor to the Northwest economy and to meeting our needs. In summary, since 1980, the Northwest region has saved enough electricity through codes and standards, utility programs, to be equivalent to roughly 6 Seattles in annual electricity consumption, or more than 1 1/4 times the actual consumption of the state of Oregon. So it's a significant contributor. It roughly represents our 2nd largest resource in the region. It's met 55% of load growth since 1980. So we really believe in energy efficiency that is cost effective. The reason I'm here is to talk to you about the role that federal standards have played in making that happen and what they look like going forward. Over the past 35 years, federal standards have basically produced 1/5 of the total savings that we've been able to achieve. Energy codes about 20%, and the remaining through ratepayer-funded utility programs. 1/5 of the savings turns out to be worth about $1 billion in annual savings on an annual basis, and saves about 5 million metric tons of carbon off of our system. And we have a very clean system because about half of our power comes from hydroelectricity. So that's a significant component of us. It's about 10% of our total carbon emissions on an annual basis. So on a going forward basis, we looked at the federal standards that have been adopted between 2009 and 2014. Those standards alone will reduce our forecast load growth from 1.1% to 0.8%, about 30% reduction in load growth. Again, saving significant consumer cost for new generation and saving consumer pain and agony from carbon emissions. So we are here to support those standards because not only they have been a huge benefit to us, but we have been involved in the negotiations that led to not only the federal standards, but many of the standards that have been adopted since 1987. I'm a member of the Appliance Standards Rulemaking Advisory Committee that was appointed by DOE to facilitate better communication between manufacturers and advocates for energy efficiency to begin to develop more transparent and open processes to engage in rulemaking. And that, since the advent of that committee, which was basically formed at the behest of the department itself, because it understood that it could do a better job of rulemaking in negotiations than it could in a standard notice and comment process. It can't always do a better job, but in some instances, particularly Elizabeth noted the appliance rulemaking for air conditioners and packaged rooftop systems, those consensus agreements between manufacturers and advocates have produced better standards, more regulatory certainty on behalf of the manufacturers, and greater compromise and facility to implement standards on behalf of the manufacturers. So I think that particular improvement was not envisioned in the original statute, but it was a regulatory process that DOE implemented on a voluntary basis and has improved immeasurably the transparency of the standards development process on a going forward basis. And I think that we can talk more about that in the time that you have questions for me. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Ekman. And our next witness and last witness is Mr. Stephen Urick, who's the president and CEO of the Air Conditioning, Heating, and Refrigeration Institute. So thanks for being with us, and you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Whitfield, Ranking Member Rush, and members of the subcommittee for inviting me to testify on this important topic. I'm Steve Urick, and I'm the president and CEO of the Air Conditioning, Heating, and Refrigeration Institute. AHRI has 315 member companies that manufacture more than 90% of the residential, commercial, and industrial air conditioning, space heating, water heating, and commercial refrigeration equipment sold, installed in North America. Our members employ over 100,000 people in manufacturing and more than 1 million American jobs when you include those involved in distribution, installation, and maintenance of our equipment. I want to make it clear that our industry has a long record of leadership when it comes to innovation, energy efficiency, and environmental stewardship. In fact, the equipment our members produce is 50% more efficient than it was just 20 years ago. But even as we innovate and develop the next generation of highly efficient equipment, we always have in mind the needs of our customers, who are, after all, the people who buy and use our equipment. We have three main concerns with the current statute that I'd like to discuss today. First, the authority Congress set forth for setting efficiency standards, the Energy Policy Conservation Act, is 40 years old and has not been updated to reflect new technologies and economic realities. Two, in addition to the impact on our industries, consumers are paying a heavy price, both in real monetary costs and in comfort and safety. When new equipment costs more than consumers can afford, they find alternatives, some of which compromise their comfort and safety while saving less energy, and in some cases, actually using more energy. Finally, American jobs are being lost in part because of the promulgation of ever more stringent efficiency regulations. And the worst thing is, DOE admits that these regulations cost jobs. While the Clinton administration issued 6 major efficiency rules during his 8 years in office, the current administration issued 8 major efficiency rules in 2014 alone. There are real consequences from this rush to regulate. Yes, complying with these rules costs my member companies millions and millions of dollars. But what is far more important, it should be far more worry to Congress, is that American jobs are being lost, and consumers who are already feeling financially squeezed are being forced to pay more for products they rely on in their everyday lives, from comfort cooling and heating to refrigeration to hot water. EPCA requires that all efficiency standards meet the twin tests of technically feasible and economically justified. And yet, DOE has issued rules that use unrealistic assumptions in its analyses to justify higher efficiency levels. I'll give you a couple examples. For commercial boilers, DOE estimates the new standard would save just 0.8% more energy than the existing standard, but would cost manufacturers up to $24 million to comply. For residential boilers and commercial refrigeration equipment, DOE justified the economic impact of the higher efficiency levels by using the assumption that no matter how much the product increases in price, demand for that product would never decrease. Every time DOE issues a new rule, it issues a press release estimating the rule's benefits in cost savings for consumers and energy savings for the nation based on theoretical models. DOE has never looked back to see what the energy savings actually were, or if consumers actually ever benefited from spending more money. And the current law does not even require such a review. Finally, DOE projects future job losses in several of its rulemakings for our products. For example, in 2 separate rulemakings for different types of commercial air conditioning units, DOE noted small business manufacturers would need to redesign their entire product offering or leave the market. DOE acknowledged in a potential scenario in which a rulemaking for commercial refrigeration equipment could cause all existing production to be moved outside of the United States, resulting in a loss of over 3,500 jobs. Changes to EPCA should be implemented in phases with the collaboration of all stakeholders. I urge all members of the upcoming conference committee to ensure that the technical corrections in H.R. 8 remain part of the final energy bill. Broader EPCA reform should stress flexibility, enhance technical and economic justifications, and the process should be overhauled to maximize transparency and stakeholder engagement. Congress should require DOE to convene stakeholders to discuss and recommend a new regulatory framework. AHRI is ready to work with Congress, DOE, and other stakeholders on ways we can together fix and update this 40-year-old law to create a new, more open process, conserve energy, help manufacturers remain competitive in the global marketplace, and benefit all consumers. I appreciate the chance to appear today, and I look forward to answering any questions you might have and to working with you as we move forward on this important issue.
Well, thank you, Mr. Urick, and thank all of you very much for your testimony. We appreciate it, and I recognize myself for 5 minutes of questions. Ms. Miller, the George Washington University Regulatory Study Center, how old is this center?
It began in 2009.
2009.
That's right.
And how long have you been there?
Since 2012.
2012.
Mm-hmm.
So, if you were running for public office or you were going to some Rotary Club speaking somewhere around the country, could you categorically say that these efficiency regulations are saving consumers money because the reduction in electricity cost exceeds the additional cost of the new appliance?
I would say that these standards have very different effects on different households based on some of the characteristics that I mentioned and also some that I state as well in my written testimony. For instance, if you live in Texas, maybe it's more beneficial for you to have an efficient air conditioner, but do you care how efficient your furnace is? How often are you ever going to use it?
Right.
In that case, you may not actually save any money by getting an efficient furnace. So I would say that different situations.
So a geographical area would have an impact on it.
Absolutely.
And then you indicated the use of the product obviously would have an impact on it. And you mentioned, I think, that some elderly people who maybe use it less would have less benefit from it as well. Is that correct?
That is correct. And the department includes that in its analysis.
So, you know, all of us make comments about, well, this is going to save money and so forth, but it's certainly possible, and in many instances, I would assume that low-income people and elderly are harmed more by these regulations, perhaps, than they are benefited. Would you agree with that?
That seems to be the case, and the department also does acknowledge that there are negative impacts on those groups in its own analyses. So that's. Okay. It's not a view that's outside the mainstream.
Well, now, originally this started because of the Arab oil embargo. I mean, the reason that this all started was because of trying to conserve the use of energy. And certainly that has changed today because we have an abundance of energy in America, but today it's become more of a climate change issue. That's what people talk about. Well, we've got to stop it. We've got to be more efficient, less CO2, and so forth. Now, Mr. McGuire, you and Mr. Cosgriff and Mr. Urick all touched on this, the need for reform. You all made some pretty strong statements. You said that sometimes the product is not going to be as effective. It's going to cost more to consumers. It's going to reduce consumer choice. And one comment I would also make on H.R. 8, which is our energy bill, one of the most controversial aspects of it related to the process that the DOE goes through in adopting these new standards. For example, they really are not transparent on it. The data analysis is not really available until they get ready to notice it. And so all we were saying in this one provision, which was like we were turning the world upside down, was we want DOE to sit down with the manufacturers, the people who make these goods, and have a more open and transparent discussion with them. I mean, you would agree with that, right?
We would agree with that, Mr. Chairman, and actually that process that you're describing used to be used by the Department of Energy, where manufacturers would have an opportunity to test a product under a new standard or to even employ a new test procedure before you could determine whether a standard was appropriate. But what we've seen in the last several years is because so many rulemakings are going on at the same time, that DOE has not been able to go through this very thorough process of let's do a test procedure and make sure that works. The test can be repeatable and reproducible before we set a standard so that companies can see if you can test a product. It's very, manufacturers spend an enormous amount of resources on compliance to these standards. The testing is very complicated.
Right.
These products are more sophisticated than they used to be, so you want to get that right. You don't want to mess that up. And what's happened is the process has become conflated, and it's very difficult to understand what's happening sometimes.
And Mr. Cosgriff, do you agree with that, basically?
I would agree with that. Made me think as Mr. McGuire was answering your question, the product cycle of some of the products entering the market now in our area, LED lamps as an example, is in many cases less than a year. So if you miss one of these hurdles I referred to, you've missed a product cycle. That's a very big deal. And for a small or medium-sized company, of which there's many making LEDs, that could be fatal.
Well, I have a lot of other questions, but my time has already expired. So, Mr. Rush, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
I want to thank you again, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Knowles, I want to thank you for your interesting testimony so far. There's a question that I have, and there is an argument that while the efficiency standards have been very valuable in reducing energy costs and consumption, many of these standards have already reached their maximum efficacy, and we cannot squeeze any more juice from the grapes in a certain manner of speaking. Do you agree with the statement that many of these appliances are as efficient as they can reasonably become, or is there there's little to no room to move forward with these new standards, or do you believe that there are some more cost-effective standards and measures and pathways that we can implement in order to have more efficiencies and cost savings?
Thank you, Congressman Rush. Yes, I do think that there are more cost-effective pathways to achieve greater energy savings that have yet to come. And I'd begin by just, as I stated in my opening remarks, the rule that was finalized just last year for commercial rooftop units, represented the largest energy saving single standard in agency history. And that was the third time that standard had been revised. And while this is going to deliver, huge consumer and environmental value, it was nowhere near the most energy efficient technology that's commercially available. So it just suggests that there is still room to improve. And I would also note that, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, that the forthcoming report from ACEEE and the Appliance Standards Awareness Project looks at the rules that will be up for revision in the next 8 years, and has shown that the energy savings opportunity from those rules will exceed that of those that were finalized in the last 8 years. Again, just further suggesting that, and some of those standards will be ones that will be products that have already had standards and have gone through revisions in the past. And I did finally just say that standards increase innovation, and that innovation, that technological innovation creates new product features, new design opportunities. Our refrigerators today have more features than ever before. And that also could unlock opportunities for increased energy savings. And that could form the baseline for future revisions to standards in the future.
Yes, ma'am. I want to shift my focus. My office has had many conversations regarding energy efficiency standards for appliances and their impacts on low-income families. One of the arguments that we hear quite often is that the cost of complying with new energy efficiency standards will have a disproportionate impact on low-income consumers. How do you respond to this charge? And secondly, are there any benefits to low-income households if industry is forced to comply with the most current energy efficiency appliance standards?
Thank you. I guess I'd begin by saying I know that the impacts on low-income customers is a priority of yours, as it is for NRDC. And minimum efficiency standards set a dependable level of energy efficiency that every American can count on. Our analysis suggests that appliance standards will save the average American household, including low-income households, $500 a year compared to before standards were set. So that is significant. And I agree that low-income households pay a disproportionately higher portion of their income goes to energy costs. And a recent report by NRDC and ACEEE shows that energy efficiency is a key strategy for addressing and reducing that energy burden that those low-income households face. So I'd say that is why groups like the National Consumers Law Center and Texas Rose and other consumer advocacy groups engage and are highly active in the standard setting process because of the important benefits that it serves for the low-income populations that they support.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. This time recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is actually a very good panel. There really is more that unites us than divides us on this whole debate, and I think that's true across the board. And first of all, from Mr. McGuire, Mr. Cosgriff, and Mr. Urick, you're saying that there is there's a need for some reform, but you're not claiming that there's a desire to jettison energy efficiency standards, are you?
No, not at all. We're supporters of the program.
Okay, I'm going to go quickly. So, Mr. Cosgriff?
Absolutely not.
And Mr. Urick?
No.
So this is an example where we really can work together to get some sensible changes to affect folks like the narrative that I provided earlier today. There is a trap that people do fall into from big federal agencies and the rolling out of regs, and as the fluorescent light bulb case, Mr. Cosgriff, that they get caught in a trap, and you don't want to miss a cycle of putting a product on the shelves, because for a small company that could be deadly. So, and Ms. Noll, you did mention in the discussion with my colleague Mr. Rush that we should. The confusing thing is we're not talking from a baseline of families. What is a family? What is a cost? I think Ms. Miller mentioned it. Her cost and a two-family household is different than a family. I'm one of 7 kids, 9, and the family grew up. A lot different costs, a lot different projected savings. Don't you think that if we're going to have this debate that the Department of Energy ought to help us define what is a family, what is a savings, and to have part of that transparency? Ms. Noll?
Thank you. I would say that the Department of Energy does take into account many perspectives.
But don't you think they should help define this so we could have a better, accurate discussion of what these savings are and who they're saying? This amorphous savings is being disputed by economists based upon real data and real numbers.
I say, as many of the colleagues that I work with, we strive to get better data on that.
The question is, shouldn't the Department of Energy help us
and the Department of
define their savings? The answer is they don't. Mr. Urick, following up on this question, don't you think they should do a better job? Department of Energy should help us define savings and costs?
Yes, I think the process, the DOE is in a bind in some ways by the statutory language of this 40-year-old act and how they're required to do the analysis. They're in a bind by the time frame in which they need to do all these rules. They don't have the time anymore because of all the rules that they're involved in to do the deep analysis that they used to be able to do and confer with everybody. And they also have a court order saying that they need to meet these deadlines.
Okay, let's go
So-
quickly to job losses. You highlighted in part of your written testimony. Talk about the job losses, and shouldn't the DOE talk about that there is a loss of jobs, especially as you get to this point of, as again my colleague Mr. Rush says, how much juice are you squeezing from the grape? And you identify that just in your testimony.
Yes, I think that's one of the economic analysis that needs to be done. And I think they forget the purpose of this act is not to go to the maximum tech and maximum efficiency. It's to slowly raise the bottom so that everybody can purchase that equipment and have those savings. There's other programs such as Mr. McGuire mentioned related to Energy Star that are the pull to get those other higher efficient and get people to buy that equipment. What we're seeing now is that this program is being used to go to the max tech versus going to the minimal level where people get savings and benefits but don't have the cost.
Aren't you asking for a return to a collaborative approach with the Department of Energy, Mr. McGuire?
Yes, we are.
Mr. Cosgriff?
More collaborative, yes.
Mr. So I do have to applaud the DOE. We have actually been pressuring them years, and also the EPA, to say, tell us how this affects jobs. So in this most recent proposed rule, March 12th, 2015, this was what it says. Some large manufacturers have already begun moving production to lower cost countries. Short-term U.S. job loss. This is the Department of Energy saying that. And an amended standard that necessitates large increases in labor content or that requires large expenditures to retool facilities should cause other manufacturers to reevaluate production siting options. What that means is that if we squeeze too much, my colleague Mr. Wright, if we go too much, we lose jobs to overseas manufacturers, and that would be unfortunate. Thank you, and I yield back my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Pallone from New Jersey, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Noll, from listening to some of the people sitting next to you on the panel and some of my colleagues on the other side, you'd think that the standards process has suddenly become far more contentious than it used to be. In my opening statement, I talked about the fact that the standard setting process has always yielded some controversy from one industry to another, and that's not to say that complaints or controversies weren't always important or even valid, but I just see some contention as an inevitable part of any meaningful standard setting process, no matter how well it functions. So while not every standard can be negotiated, my sense is that there has been more consensus than ever before, and that every industry trade represented here today has been involved in and likely benefited from that consensus. So my question is, do you agree with me that there actually seems to have been more consensus in the standards setting process over the past 8 years? And of the rules finalized in the last 8 years, what percentage of those rules has been established through consensus negotiations, if you could?
Good morning. It's interesting because I think about the number of rules and the number of negotiations that have taken place over the years, and there's so many to choose from. I mean, the last two revisions to home air conditioning standards went through a consensus process and landed in a negotiated consensus outcome. And that's fantastic for consumers and the value that's going to deliver to them and for the environment as well. So I think, from my perspective, I would say that, the controversy is the exception and not the rule. That we can demonstrate, I think, as I said in my opening remarks, of the 42 standards that have been finalized since 2009, almost a quarter of those stemmed from joint consensus negotiations. And that's not to say that every rule needs to or can come from a consensus or a negotiation, and those that didn't went through the normal rulemaking process. And with the exception of maybe a few standards, have been without controversy and supported by stakeholders through the process and input. So I would just encourage us not to characterize action as controversy at this point.
All right. Now, I'm a strong supporter of energy efficiency programs, and again, I'm confused by some of the claims being made by members of today's panel. I find it difficult to believe that there are no more significant energy efficiency gains to consumer products unless you assume that we can't improve upon current technology or develop entirely new technologies that are more energy efficient. For example, TV went from tubes to liquid crystal displays to plasma to LED in a little over a decade. So are we truly done with refrigerators, dishwashers, air conditioners, furnaces, whatever?
Our experience has been no. I mean, I think in the latest refrigerator standard revision, this was the 6th time, including the state standards, that standard had been revised. It represented about 20 to 30% improvement over the previous standard, and that's on par with other revisions, fully supported by manufacturers and stakeholders. And I think we've seen, that trajectory is held true, that refrigerators are now 75% more efficient. They have more product features, are 20% larger, and they cost half as much. I think the lighting revolution that we've seen take place is another example of, I don't think in 2000 we could have predicted the number of choices and the efficiency that we would get from LEDs today. So I think it's just a few examples of where this could be headed.
Right. Several witnesses have referred to mandatory serial rulemakings, and my understanding of the law is that it mandates the review of a standard every 6 years. However, to my knowledge, the law doesn't require that the standard be updated every 6 years. So just to clarify, would you just answer yes or no to the following questions, okay? Does the law require a standard be reviewed every 6 years, yes or no?
Once it's gone through its statutory requirements, then yes, it's required to be reviewed every 6 years.
All right, does the law mandate that a standard be updated every 6 years, regardless of any other fact pattern?
No.
Does the DOE have to determine whether a rulemaking is likely to result in significant savings before requiring a standard be updated?
Yes.
And does DOE have to determine whether a rulemaking is likely to be technologically feasible and cost-effective before updating a standard?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks a lot. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time's expired. The chair uses the privilege of the vice chairman to recognize himself for 5 minutes. And a hearty Texas welcome to Mrs. Miller, Mr. McGuire, Ms. Noll, Mr. Cosgrove, Mr. Ekman, and Mr. Urick. In the interest of time, I have one question about air conditioning. Southeast Texas, my home, exists in a climate we call 95-95. From early April to late September, it's 95 degrees Fahrenheit with 95% humidity. Until 1902, the only jobs in that region were picking cotton and guarding prisoners in big state prisons. That provided very, very slow, low growth. And then, well, this Carrier invented the air conditioner in 1902. That single invention, combined with oil being discovered at Spindletop in 1901 in Beaumont, and the 51-mile Houston ship channel being built, has put Houston on track to be the nation's 3rd largest city sometime this decade. Federal actions affecting air conditioning gets the attention of all Texans, especially if two federal agents are in conflict. We're seeing that situation right now with air conditioners. DOE is demanding higher efficiency standards for air conditioners, while EPA is banning certain refrigerants and foam blowing agents from being used in air conditioners. So my only question is for you, Mr. McGuire, and you, Mr. Urick. Mr. Urick first. Can companies comply with these conflicting standards? Can they comply with these? What are their challenges?
First off, yes, they can comply with it, but how they comply with it is it costs a considerable amount of money in the conflict between the two statutes going into effect, in the needs to spend money on research and development. And then once the research and development is completed, they need to then retool their plants. And so yes, they can do it. It's going to cost. The big manufacturers that have the funds will have the ability to do it. There'll be several of the small manufacturers that don't have the funds available that will go out of business, either being acquired by the bigger ones or just leaving the area.
The big guys thrive, the small guys go away. Mr. McGuire, your thoughts? Can they survive? Can they compete? Do you work with these conflicting regulations from different departments?
The industry can comply, but the problem is it takes a certain amount of time to do that. And the EPA decisions, proposals on refrigerants is not being coordinated with DOE on the efficiency standards, where the vast majority of greenhouse gas emission avoidance benefits come from, the appliance standards, not changing the refrigerants. We have to deal with the fact that the safety standards in the U.S. do not allow the type of refrigerants we have to go to yet in the amounts necessary. That requires a safety risk assessment test that companies are doing. So it takes an amount of time, sequence, and investment for this to happen, and it would be prudent for the two agencies to talk about this and reach a decision that makes sense for the environment and for the people that are making these products.
Follow-up question, sir. Do you believe the Obama administration is meeting their own goals set with their executive orders to minimize the cumulative impact of these regulations, burn these regulations? They said, let's make that lower. Does this achieve that, or is this in violation of that?
We do not believe the DOE is doing a proper analysis of the cumulative regulatory burden on manufacturers when they're doing their appliance efficiency standards, because they're not taking into account the cost and investments that have been made for previous versions that haven't been recouped, as well as the investments that have to be made in alternative refrigerants.
Mr. Urick, your thoughts, sir?
I agree with Mr. McGuire in that proper analysis has not been done, and the burden on manufacturers is not being considered and actually has been ignored when raised in some of the rulemakings related to commercial refrigeration equipment, where we did raise EPA changing the refrigerants that could be used at the same time efficiency regulations went into effect. And DOE said, well, they haven't changed it yet, so we're using the current refrigerant. They issued the rule. 6 months later, EPA banned those refrigerants. There's two different implementation dates. One is 2016 for the refrigerants and 2017 for the energy efficiency standards. You have to redesign twice in 2 different periods of time.
Thank you. My time's expired. One word of warning, don't mess with Texas air conditioners. Chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Ms. McNerney, for 5 minutes.
I thank the Assistant Chair. Mr. Cosgriff, I believe that you stated that many of the imported products are not held to the same standards as American-made products. Is that right?
I didn't say many. I said that we should be on guard to make sure that non-qualified products enter the stream of commerce inside the United States.
So is that must be happening then? Is that happening, or products entering the American?
We receive information from our manufacturers routinely that they find products in the stream that don't, by objective standards, meet the standards of the United States of America.
So consumers, U.S. consumers are buying products made overseas that are potentially less efficient and cost American jobs at the same time?
They might be, yes, sir.
How could we remedy that situation?
Well, NEMA in the past has worked with Commerce in the area, for instance, of counterfeiting to take our expertise from our member companies and make it available to Customs and Border Security, to make it available to their agents so they can know what they're looking for, to be able to identify what constitutes a valid third-party certification mark, what might be a counterfeit, and other tells that you might see in products.
So this is an enforcement issue. It's not a trade rules issue.
Mostly enforcement, yes, sir.
Okay, very good. Mr. Ekman, please elaborate a little bit, if you would, on how the rulemaking process could be improved, the transparency of the rulemaking process could be improved.
I'll go through a little bit of history so that the context is there. In mid-2000s, DOE staff directed their consulting staff to sit down with advocates and manufacturers to help negotiate a white goods standard with the AHAM folks, so that the technical staff that was supporting DOE's rulemaking was appraised and involved in those negotiations that were informal at the time. They weren't authorized by DOE. We were handing those on the side. And that led to another process on electrical transformers where both DOE staff and their consultants got involved. And finally, DOE established under the Federal Administrative Procedures Act a negotiated rulemaking group called the ASRAC, or the Appliance Standards Rulemaking Advisory Committee, which now oversees a series of requests that might come in from parties that want to enter into negotiations. and through a regulatory process, do a regulated negotiation as opposed to a rulemaking through a standard comment process. And that has opened, I think, the doors to more consensus agreement. The agreement on major refrigeration products, the HVAC equipment, pumps, and electrical transformers all came from those kinds of negotiations where there's a great deal more transparency, interaction with the manufacturers, with advocates, and DOE staff and its consultants, because they can get down and talk face-to-face, roll the sleeves up in a meeting, not in a very formal hearings type process. And I think that has improved both the outcomes and the feelings that come out of those outcomes about we agree that we can't get everything we need, but the compromise works for all of us. And that process, to me, is really central to and advancing the rulemaking process.
Thank you. Mr. Cosgriff, again, you mentioned that or I'm going to ask this question, do you believe that the current standards have room to drive more innovation?
Do I believe the current standards
can drive more innovation?
Can drive more innovation. I think the manufacturers are driving innovation. I think competition is driving innovation, and I think standards have a part in that, but I wouldn't overstate what their part is. So if a product is at the low end of efficiency, then the standards are a welcome boost. If a product like a transformer is at approaching 99% efficiency, I'm not sure what they're accomplishing.
Thank you. Ms. Noll, could you give some examples of efficiency improvements that are still possible?
Yes, I'd be happy to. You know, I think that as we look at some of the products that will be revised in the next 8 years, there are standards for equipment and household appliances that have seen standards before. Water heaters is likely a potential opportunity for increased savings. As Mr. Cosgriff just mentioned, distribution transformers, I mean, they may be reaching a high level of efficiency, but all of the electricity that is produced in America goes through transformers. So even 0.5% improvement there is going to be a significant national benefit. So I do think that there is opportunities that still exist to improve through the standards process.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Latta, for 5 minutes.
Well, thanks, Mr. Chairman, and I also like to echo that I think this is a great panel today and really appreciate you all being here. I'm kind of an expert. My wife and I in the last 6 weeks just bought a washer and dryer, and the refrigerator's next. But in Northwest Ohio, we do make HVAC, we make dishwashers, we make dryers, we make washing machines. We also make waffle irons, we make large mixers, and we also have a large freezer plant right in West Central Ohio. So we got a lot of things going on, and it's very important to our economy. But Mr. McGuire, if I could start with you. You've been particularly critical of the proposed new standard for dishwashers. Can you explain what is wrong with this standard, both in terms of the substance of the proposed rule as well as the process by which it has come about?
Well, the proposed dishwasher standard from last year, first of all, it required a 20-year payback to the consumer for a product whose useful life is 13 years. It reduced the amount of water that a dishwasher uses in a cycle from 5 gallons to 3. And the proposed rule did not go through any type of performance or consumer testing before it was issued. We did not get a chance to do that. We normally do in these rulemakings. So
let me interrupt. Now, why didn't you get to be part of that?
DOE just didn't do that part of the process. They just went right to the rule without that type of testing. So once it was proposed, we did the testing, and we demonstrated to DOE and others that dishes were not cleaned. And multiple product manufacturers' products, it did not clean the dishes. So the utility of the product was affected, the consumer payback was not there, and the energy savings was minimal, less than a quad, 7% of 1 quad. Now, the current dishwasher standard that's in place today, that has a payback to the consumer of 12 years. So that was already at the limit in terms of economic sense. There was no need for this 5th dishwasher standard. So it messed up the product, and it did not make sense for the consumer to buy such a product. So our view is that there's something wrong when the process spits something out like that. That has to be a product or a category where you don't do another rulemaking unless some quantifiable measure can show that there's going to be a real significant savings in energy that won't harm the consumer. But under the current process, it's very difficult to get DOE's assumptions and other things that go into their analyses done by their contractors or the national labs. So that's part of the process change we would like to see.
You know, just out of curiosity, when you were doing this testing, when you were going from 5 gallons to 3 gallons, how much did that cost the industry, and then what did that cost the consumer in the end run then?
Well, how much did it cost the consumer for
Well, when you were doing the testing, when it was showing going from the 5 gallons down to the 3 gallons, you said, and I was just curious, is there a cost to the industry that you had to do? And and then what was, you know, overall that'd have to, I assume it would go back to the consumer.
Well, these tests that we did on this proposed rule were, you know, this standard didn't go into effect, so those costs were absorbed by the companies. They're thousands of dollars to do these tests. But once the standard is in effect, in order to prove your compliance with the standard, you have to test your product before it's submitted to the marketplace, and then a regular routine testing, market surveillance, that our industry actually does some of that testing to police ourselves and provide some information to the government. But those tests are very expensive, and the cost of compliance, the tolerances are very, very tight. So manufacturers invest a lot to make sure their products meet the standards, and the tests are sophisticated. So it's a costly part of being an appliance manufacturer, and those costs go into the product like any other costs and are passed on to the consumer.
Thank you. Mr. Urick, I'm concerned about the economic effects that the administration's aggressive regulatory agenda has. It's my understanding that DOE is implementing rules that set new standards for individual components in your members' residential and consumer products, such as the new standard for the efficiency of furnace fans. How does regulating a specific component in a large heating or cooling system add to the cost of a furnace or air conditioning system?
We have a lot of concern, and I think looking at this 40-year-old law, that it's dealing with products, and in some instances it's going into the components in those products and pieces of equipment, and which is the wrong direction. Really what we should be looking at is how these products are put into the house or into the building, and looking at an overall systems approach to efficiency to really look at the gains. Because if you start dictating and regulating the components, be it the compressor, now they're looking at regulating the fans that go into the HVAC, the air conditioning and furnaces and others, you're dictating how these products are designed. And once they're put into that product, they might have, and we've shown in a case and a proposal out with the California Energy Commission when they were doing this with air handlers, what they were proposing on the efficiency level for fans actually used more energy when applied in the air handler than being able to design the overall product and the energy use of that air handler. And so we just want to make sure that this is done rationally, and the current law doesn't give DOE that type of authority to look at the broader picture. And I think we just need to step back and say, it's 40 years old. Let's look at it and make some changes and make it better so we can actually get some energy savings out in the field and have consumers be able to afford the equipment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. My time's expired. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Vermont, Mr. Welch, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. This is a great panel. Appreciate it. A couple of things. We don't have a bill yet, right? So this is kind of an abstract discussion. And I thought Mr. Shimkus kind of laid out the potential for cooperation here. I do like the notion of collaboration in the process because you've got folks at DOE who are doing their best to implement efficiency standards. You've got real-world folks that are the manufacturers that have to contend with the very practical issues of implementation. I mean, Ms. Noll, you're okay with that, right? Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, I think standards are incredibly important. I don't think they're everything. I mean, Mr. Cosgriff, you mentioned that the standard in some cases, especially at the low end, does spur the innovation. But if you've got something that's highly efficient, then it's not going to accomplish all that much. I mean, a lot of what you're saying sounds very reasonable to me. The jobs issue, I think it really is all out. It's not so much the jobs issue. I mean, air conditionings, by the way, I mean, one of the most outrageous loss of jobs is with Carrier leaving Indiana to go down to $3 an hour wages in Mexico, which I think is pretty appalling, but it has nothing to do with standards, particularly since whatever it is manufactured at $3 an hour has to meet the standards before it can come back into this country, right? So, you know, you've got a level playing field as long as the standards apply to everywhere. But I do, as a strong supporter of efficiency standards with Mr. McKinley, who's got a lot of experience in this, I feel that those of us who believe standards can work have to be extremely diligent in trying to address practical concerns as they come up. That makes sense to me. So I've heard the industry folks saying that you're not for unraveling them, you want them to be more practical. Yeah, and you know, I'm not asking a lot of questions because I don't think there's that much disagreement and we don't have a bill. But one of the things I think that would be helpful as part of this process would be to get the DOE folks in here and ask them what are some of perhaps the congressionally imposed burdens we're imposing on them, where you're saying that they've got so many rules they've got to deal, they don't have the time and the space. But bottom line here, collaboration I think is really good. I think standards are absolutely essential. I mean, the energy efficiency savings that we've had have been tremendous. If they're done right, it can save consumers money. It's not without impact. I mean, we all understand that. But there was a cost associated with requiring that automobile manufacturers install seatbelts. That costs more money when you bought a car. But most of us think it's about time. Mileage standards have been tremendous. That is a cost, but it's really had an impact on the average mileage in our fleet. So really, what I'm asking for is to take up Mr. Shimkus on his observation that this is an area where there's some opportunity for us to cooperate, but that means not letting it get adversarial. If there's acknowledgement even from the people who are affected by this in ways that they think are a little too aggressive, to have some interaction with DOE and us to try to figure out what are the process improvements we can make in order to get the benefits of regulation. I mean, I'll just ask the industry people, Mr. McGuire, Mr. Ekman, or Mr. Urick, is that a problem for you, the approach I'm talking about?
It's not a problem. We've used consensus many times in the past, but we think consensus ought to be to change the law so that the process requires these improvements and they're not discretionary.
Well, that's got to be a discussion. There's no specifics here, all right? So you're making, we don't have a bill in front of us.
There are some process improvements in the energy bill in conference, but the ones we're talking about, the major reforms, you're right, there is not.
Well, I'll tell you what would be helpful for me. If each of you did like a one-page bullet point assessment of concrete things that you think in the process would improve it. Then we can assess it, have a discussion. We can talk to DOE. How does that work? Would it improve it or not? What's the downside? You know, we're just having this real abstract discussion here. And the regulations, I think, are really important and it can be really beneficial, but they also, if they're not done right, can have a lot of downside to them with no upside. Ms. Noll, how about you? What I'm saying is...
I would be happy to do that. I would also encourage us to look at some of these where the process is working. And I think, you know, dishwashers is an example of that where DOE heard from industry and Congress granted them the authority to look at consumer utility and performance as one of the criteria.
Well, that'd be helpful.
For economic justification. So
no, that would be helpful.
This as an example of how it's working and how it's serving to protect consumers and also ensuring a balanced, you know, both the impacts on manufacturers as well as the impacts on consumers and the environment and are reducing our energy consumption.
That makes sense. What about you, Mr.
The gentleman's time's expired. I'm sorry, sir. Got to move on. Votes coming up. I recognize the gentleman from West Virginia, Mr. McKinley, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me just build a little bit on some of the remarks that have been made earlier about some of the credentials of several. Peter Welch and I have had a wonderful working relationship. we chair the efficiency caucus. We put language into the current energy bill that we're waiting to see what's going to happen in the Senate. We've been to the White House for signatures on an energy efficiency bill. So this is something I think he and I really grasp fairly well with this. Back when I was in private practice engineering, we designed some of the first LEED certified schools and office buildings in West Virginia. I'm working with Tonka over on energy efficiency with the turbines to create electricity to make that more efficient. So energy efficiency is one of the prime areas that I like to play with and get involved in here. But I get to a point, there's a vast differences, and I want to play back a little bit on what my colleague and good friend, Bobby Rush from Illinois was talking about, was the disparity of income when people were facing this. If you look at this, it poses a challenge for all of us. It really does for us. If you look at Mississippi, my colleague here from Harper, from Mississippi, their median family income is $36,000 a year. In Mississippi, $36,000 a year. But in Maryland, it's over $70,000 per family income. But so in those affluent states or neighborhoods, they make choices. They have choices. You'll probably, if we went through the motor vehicle licensing, we find they probably have more BMWs and Lexus cars there than we have in some other areas of the country or in neighborhoods. So cars are going to be different because people have choices. We have housing, that there are different pricing for housing because people have choices for that. We have health care. When you go to the exchanges under Obamacare, there are different exchanges you get, so people have choices. But when it comes to their major consumer appliance, they don't. For your air conditioning, your refrigerator, your range, your dishwasher, your furnace, all of these have been mandated that this is the only one that they have available to them. I'm troubled with that because of the diversity of income, their capability of doing it. And don't tell me it's going to save me $500 a year, because we understand the whole payback is so much longer on all the. So I'm wondering, is there a suggestion you all could make that might make it more palatable for people to be able to have a choice so that they're not confronted with this hard decision? I know of families that are trying to fix anything they can, their equipment as much as they make it last as long as possible, because they know that they can't afford the cost of the new one, and so they're spending a lot of money in repairs because they don't have a choice. They know what the cost is. That air conditioning costs the same in Connecticut as it does in Mississippi, or that dishwasher. So what would you suggest that we in Congress could do to maybe ameliorate some of these differences a little bit, so that the poor communities, the area or states that have trouble, how can they afford to have this cost? Can some of you, okay, Mr.
Congressman, I think this is a really important issue, and I think it's bringing back the balance that was originally put out in the 40-year-old law, where it says technically feasible and economically justified. Right now, the focus is too much on the technical feasibility and saying, hey, my manufacturers manufacture products everywhere from the federal minimum to very high efficiency. Yes, we could go to the high efficiency, but we need to look at the cost. And I think it's bringing that balance back to that economic justification and saying this law is intended to raise that floor slowly. People that have the incomes in Maryland and other places are going to purchase the things with all the different bells and whistles on their refrigerators, their dishwashers, their air conditioners, and everything else. But there's a lot of people in this country, when you look at the cost now of the minimum efficient air conditioner, you're looking at $6,000 to $10,000 at a minimum that is done in an unplanned time, because most of the time these units go out when it's the hottest day of the year, or the furnace when it's the coldest day of the year. And the Federal Reserve just had a study last week that said over 47% of the American people have less than $400 in emergency cash available to them. So what are they going to do? They need that comfort. In the wintertime, they need the heat. A lot of times, for medical reasons, they need that the cooling in the summer. And so it's bringing back that balance. you know, and probably putting more of an emphasis on the economic justification versus the technical.
My time's expired, but all I can ask, could each of the six of you, would you mind putting a little paper to me or something to say what you would suggest that might be a solution to help out for families in depressed areas? Thank you very much. I yield back.
Gentleman's time expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Tonko, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses. And certainly we're citing a 40-year history here. And again, to repeat what my colleague from Vermont indicated, we have to look at some of the trade situations too, where offshoring of jobs might have helped some families retain those jobs and be able to afford these items. And this job loss thing, I think, is much more complex than just suggesting standards caused it. Our energy efficiency standards have improved products that benefit all of our constituents. Many of these are not luxury goods, but necessities found in nearly every home. We've heard support for national efficiency standards from manufacturers and consumers, and we've heard from industries, from states, from environmental groups that there is consensus that this program has been a success. I'm certainly open to improving the program, but improvements cannot undermine the purpose of this program. And while we look for those improvements, we should not lose sight of the fact that this program is incredibly successful. While there have been a few contentious rules, it is my understanding that of the final rules issued since 2009, almost 1/4 were the result of negotiated consensus agreements, and only 5 have been subject to litigation. So to our witnesses, do you agree that many of these rules have been consensus-driven?
Yes.
Mr.
Mr.
Urick.
Chairman, you know, yes, most of them, as Ms. Noll said, 25% of the rules in this administration have been through the consensus process. That means 75% of those 40 others have not. And I think we all support and would encourage that negotiation consensus process because there's more of that give and take that Mr. Ekman talked about versus the notice and comment where we only have the adversarial is much more adversarial versus a negotiation, and I think that's something that we should look at.
Okay, and I think it's worth noting that DOE has a history of working to improve the program, especially around increasing stakeholder engagement dating back to the 1990s. A few years ago, DOE established, as I understand, the Appliance Standards Regulatory Advisory Committee, which formalized the process for negotiated consensus rulemakings for the first time. And a number of our witnesses participate on this committee, which includes, again, our manufacturers, our trade associations, states, and consumer groups. Can anyone comment on this committee's work and what, you know, what it is as a positive, what it might be as a positive step to formalize this process? Mr. Ekman?
Yeah, I think it has improved the process a lot, particularly where there's a likelihood that both the manufacturers and the efficiency advocates and the DOE agency personnel and consultants can come to a more flexible conclusion than would otherwise be provided. And I think it's allowed for lots of horse trading that wouldn't occur, as Mr. Carrick said, under the standard process that was rulemaking, hearings process, and file your report. So I think it's been a huge advantage. I've been a member since the committee was established. We've had multiple work groups, 7 different work groups so far, negotiating standards. They work the best when both the parties that want to participate in that come before the committee and say, we think we can work this out, give us a chance. If that's not possible, or there's not really an issue, everybody thinks we can do this through rule and comment, that's a much more expedient process. It takes a lot of time and energy to do the negotiations, as you're aware. But they turn out to be better rules as a consequence for everybody involved. And I think supporting that on a continuing basis, the ASRAC committee and process, that has has improved the process a lot.
Does anyone else choose
Mr.
to
Tonko,
comment?
I would just want to note that on the 75% that weren't consensus or joint negotiations does not mean that they weren't going through the normal rulemaking process to deliver a superior outcome. And only 5 of those rules have been litigated, and I think that is still a very small number on the grand scheme of things.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Cosgriff?
Yeah, and to Mr. Urick's point, following up a little bit, when you're sitting around a table talking about technical things, you better have the technical chops to have that conversation. And so in this highly quantified algorithm that the ASRAC and DOE consultants using, I'd like to see inside that. We have mathematicians. We can figure it out. I don't understand why we can't see what the key assumptions are and how those assumptions play inside the model that they built and then they run through the computer. So one of the things we've learned over the last 40 years, I think, is that this incoming tide has raised all the boats. This is a good news story. So now let's perfect it, but let's do it in as scientific a way as possible, and let's do it as transparently as possible.
Thank you. Anyone else? Mr. McGuire?
Mr. Tonko, I would say
I'm
that
sorry, gentleman's time has expired. We've got votes coming up here, my friends, so make it quick. I recognize the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Long, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. McGuire, could you recommend to me what type of hair dryer would be the best to purchase for my dishwasher so I can dry my dishes whenever the cycle is through?
I'll provide that for the record.
My dishes are not feeling the burn as they once did. So, Mr. Cosgriff, in some of the testimony given today, the issue of the Department of Energy coordinating better with other agencies was mentioned as an area for improvement, particularly in the area of making sure that imported products containing regulated components are held to the same standards as domestically manufactured products are on their own. What are your thoughts on how we can ensure a level playing field for U.S.-made components?
Well, there'd be a number of things. I think clearly it may not be DOE's responsibility, but it would be their responsibility to make sure that their fellow travelers, principally customs and similar policing functions, are aware of what the standards are, what to be looking for. I think industry...
Can you pull your mic a little closer?
I think industry has a role in that, too. We should step up and offer our technical expertise. There's other distributors would have a role in that. Systems manufacturers will have a role in that. So it's not going to be one easy solution, but we don't want those products in the stream or in the system.
Well, the Energy Conservation Standards Program requires Department of Energy to start a new rulemaking procedure on a product as part of a 6-year review cycle. Could you tell me generally how long it takes to fully comply with the energy conservation standards for a product, factoring in all of the cumulative rules, including test procedures?
The number 3 years sticks in my mind. I think it would be different for different products. I mentioned lighting happens a little bit faster. If we're doing a motor, meeting a motor efficiency standard, that's a little bit more complex machine. So I think it's different. But assuming we have 3 years to get into compliance, and then that gives you 3 years of runtime before the next rulemaking kicks off. And DOE tends to, as you'd expect, and as they should, start that rulemaking early so they're able to comply with the law when they get to six years. I'd also point out in the covered products for NEMA, we know of only 2 times where the department has chosen for the cost-benefit analysis to forego the rule.
What are some of the challenges in complying with both the energy conservation standards and additional test procedures?
Congressman, that's one of the interesting things that was the change when we made the serial rule, part of the, I think it was 2005 amendments to EPCA. You have to review the standards every 6 years. And the requirement is to review the test procedures every 7. And what we're starting to see in a lot of our products, the test procedures aren't complete for the products that they're setting standards for. So as a matter of fairness, we don't even know what the test procedure is going to be and how our products are going to be measured. The information isn't there, and they're setting efficiency standards in minimum levels. And so I think the interrelationship is very important, and we need to know what the rules are, be able to evaluate what those rules are through testing our products and provide that information to DOE before they start setting the next standard. And the same thing as in the previous question, Mr. Cosgriff, our products, it's a 5-year implementation time from the standard being set and when it becomes effective. And it takes that entire time to do it. And so what we're seeing is that even before, in some cases, these standards are put into effect, we're seeing the next round. And we saw that with residential air conditioners. The standard went into effect in January of 2015. the fall of 2014, they already started discussing the next round of efficiency. So you're looking at increasing the efficiency standards on this equipment even before the prior standard went into effect.
Welcome to Washington, D.C. Mr. Cosgriff, do you care to comment on that as far as what the challenges are?
They're pretty much, as Mr. Urick said, that it's going to take us some additional time depending on the product.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman is back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Hudson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank the panel for being here today. A very informative discussion. Mr. McGuire, which of your appliances have been regulated multiple times? I mean, do you believe we're reaching a point of diminishing marginal returns with this serial rulemaking?
Virtually all of our products have been regulated multiple times. The current refrigerator standard that's been in effect since last year is the fourth version of that standard. Same for dishwashers, and the rule I mentioned that was proposed last year was the fifth revision. So we believe we hit the point of diminishing returns in the last tranche of standards that were negotiated through the consensus process. We think standards going forward for most of our products are not justified on the economics or the energy savings.
Appreciate that. Mr. Long asked one of the other panelists about the issue of having the DOE propose new standards for some products while the underlying test procedures are also changing. Would you like to elaborate on how this is a problem for you?
It's a major issue because a manufacturer cannot tell what they have to do to comply with the new standard until they know how to test to it. So that's why the law said the test procedures come first, but that process is a little out of whack right now. So in the case of portable air conditioners, we've had to comment on a proposed standard before we knew what the final test procedure was. That's really impossible to do, but that's what we're forced to do under the current process that's being employed.
Well, that seems like it's not serving the best interests of the people either. If we aren't getting a true assessment of the results of these tests, I think I obviously see why that's a mistake. Many of your manufacturers make several regulated products and face multiple rules. What's the challenge, sort of maybe you could elaborate a little more for your member companies in terms of complying with all these different requirements simultaneously, just in addition to sort of the testing thing we talked about, but just maybe elaborate on that.
The initial investment to gear up for a new standard, as Mr. Urick and Cosgriff said, is quite an investment to understand the test procedure and get your products qualified. But ongoing, once a standard is in effect, a manufacturer has to test and certify those products to the Department of Energy. If you want your products to be Energy Star qualified, that requires a further upfront test as well as ongoing testing of a certain percentage of your products. So that's a pretty significant testing burden for the manufacturers. And when the test procedures are under revision, it has to be very precise in order for you to design a product. What we've experienced also is that Energy Star sometimes will want a different test procedure than DOE requires for the standard. One of the benefits we found of negotiating the consensus process is we would peg the Energy Star requirement to the standard requirement with the same test procedure so manufacturers could plan that out. But that hasn't always been the case. So these are processes that used to be employed but haven't been across the board in recent years.
Thank you. Industry groups have repeatedly asked DOE to establish separate product categories for condensing and non-condensing covered products, only to have the DOE provide a response that condensing and non-condensing equipment provide the same utility to consumers, so there's no justification for establishing separate product categories. Is this another area that warrants an objective third-party review?
Congressman, what you're talking about is the famous furnace rule. And there, again, it's related to technology. This equipment is at a point where you have condensing and non-condensing, and there's the cost difference is considerable between the two technologies. Right now, we are at the highest level of non-condensing efficiency, and the rulemaking is looking at moving to a condensing requirement. I think the groups, this would have been a rule that would have been great for negotiation, because what we've seen over the years is that every rule that's come out has ended up in litigation. And to see that if the groups could come together and reach a solution, I think would have been a better solution. We're right now in the midst of a notice and comment, and I believe DOE has just issued their proposed rule to OMB for review, so we'll see what happens there. But having two separate product classes for condensing, non-condensing does not look like it will be something that will be put forward.
I appreciate that. And Mr. Chairman, it looks like my time's about expired, so I'll yield back.
Gentleman is back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Johnson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I, too, want to thank the panel for joining us today. Thank you all. I know this is, you've been here a while already. For Mr. McGuire, Mr. Cosgriff, and Mr. Urick, how important is early stakeholder input in the rulemaking process? I mean, what are the additional challenges that you face when DOE issues a notice of proposed rulemaking without having consulted with you beforehand? Mr. McGuire, let's start with you.
I think it's very important from an effectiveness point of view. If the manufacturer hasn't had the ability to be in a dialogue with the government about the proposal and how they expect the efficiency requirements to be achieved and do some testing, then you're really dealing in a vacuum. This is what happened with the proposed dishwasher rule. So it's very important. These are technical matters. It's very important that not only manufacturers are engaged early, but all stakeholders. This ASRAC process does do that, but the ASRAC process is useful once a decision has been made that there will be a new standard. And so what we're talking about is changing the process for determining whether there should be a new standard. If there is going to be one, consensus is always the best. We feel we will do better. I think as the advocates feel, giving a give and take, putting data on the table, and not wondering where the data came from.
Yeah. Before we go any further, I really want you guys to get the dishwasher rule right. I'm the dishwasher at my house, and if the dishwashers don't clean, I've got a real problem. So, I mean, it's going to be double work for me. So, Mr. Cosgriff, go ahead.
Well, I certainly agree with what my colleague says, and I think what I've heard is listening to this conversation is at least by the manufacturers, this is not an assault on the standards. This is we want the energy efficient economy to thrive. It's good for business, as Noll pointed out. That said, it can be more transparent. The Department of Energy has some true experts in their fields, but so do we. And it should be, as was stated, let's put the numbers on the table, and then let's bring in the business people and say, okay, the cost of efficiency improvement goes like that, but the efficiency curve is almost flat. At some point, we've got to call it enough.
Gotcha. Thank you. Mr. Urick?
I think it's very important because industry has the information that this rule is going to be based on. It has information on what technology is available. It has information on the costs. It has information on the products that are being sold today, both on the different efficiency levels. And so if that conversation doesn't occur, what is the regulator looking at to make its decision on, is there significant energy savings? Can there be energy savings? And should we move forward with the rule? And so it's very necessary for that dialogue. And I think DOE would like to have that dialogue, but again, they are tied by what you as Congress has put in this act on the serial rulemakings, where you're mandating these rules every 6 years, and they just don't have the time, to do a lot of times everything they need to do or would like to do to get these rules out and also meet the court order from the Second Circuit to make sure they meet all their deadlines.
Okay. So let's continue with you, Mr. Urick. The DOE has proposed new standards for some of your products, while the underlying test procedure is also changing. Why is this a problem for you?
Congressman, it's a huge problem, as I stated earlier, in that we need to know what the rules are. How are our products going to be measured? And again, it's getting DOE the right information. If the test procedures aren't set, how do they know how products are performing out in the field?
Is it safe to say it's pretty dadgum hard to innovate when you don't know how you're going to be measured at the end of the end of this?
You don't know what the target is. You don't know what you're going to be measured on.
You don't know where you're going any road to get you there. Yeah.
Right.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I'm going to yield back 45 seconds.
We thank the gentleman from Ohio. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Mullen, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, sir, and thank you for having this meeting. There's, I'll be honest with you, there's a few meetings that we have in here that I have to really study hard on because I'm not familiar with it. This is, as I would say, in my wheelhouse. I understand this situation extremely well. And Ms. Noll, I'm going to kind of just talk to you for probably the remainder of the time. Because a couple of things that you said, and I just kind of want to set the record straight. One, you said huge savings, that these energy efficiency standards that DOE has put huge savings. That was your words, right? Based on what?
Based on analysis.
What analysis?
The analysis that ACEEE and the Appliance Standards Awareness Project has done, as well as the Department of Energy's own analysis.
And I mean, are you really looking at bills and prices? Because you said huge savings, and then you said up to $500 a year on energy cost. Is that correct?
Correct.
So in Oklahoma, the average household today, their total energy bill a year is $1,296. So you're saying that because of your savings, that bill would have been $1,796. Is that right?
Absent standards.
Yeah. But yet, if I go back and I look at 2008, the midline Whirlpool dishwasher, the average use was about $29 a year is what that unit cost it to run. At the same time, the cost of the unit was $375. Today, the same unit is $399, and it costs $32 a month or a year to run.
The standards programs have been in effect since 1987, and we.
Yeah, I'm just talking about you said huge savings.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm trying to figure out where the huge savings are from, because right now we're just talking about dishwashers. Well, dishwashers we can see in the years have actually went up. They cost more, so that's not a savings, and they cost more to run per year. So just give me an opportunity again. Where is huge? Is huge would be massive. I mean, I'm thinking like big time. That's huge. It's your word. $500. I guess you could say that's huge, but I don't see it. That's the dishwasher. So I'll give you the mic and let you go ahead and try to explain that for me.
In my opinion, I think $2 trillion in savings to consumers is a lot of.
No, you
huge
say
savings.
$2 trillion. I'm just trying to figure out what the $2 trillion are. DOE comes in here and makes all these outlandish claims all the time. How much they're saving the mid-level households and all this stuff, and how much energy is down when energy cost is actually up. And then you're in here making claims that the household is saving money, and I'm just not seeing it. If anybody on the panel can help me, let me know, because I don't want to make a claim that's not true, and right now I'm seeing a claim that's not true. Go ahead, Ms. Miller.
I think it's a valid question to say, what is this analysis based on? And I think to reiterate some of the other remarks made by other members of this panel, it's difficult to see where those claims come from in DOE's analysis.
Right.
And if you're looking at dishwashers specifically, if you look at the standards that were finalized in 2012, they assumed, as you mentioned before, Mr. McGuire, that the payback period would be about 12 years, which is only as long as your dishwasher is going to last. And I think they assumed that households would save on net $3.
Well, let me read you a manual for a startup for a new dishwasher now. On top of it costing more to run, quote, this is out of a manual, says, run hot water at sink nearest your dishwasher until water is hot. Turn off water for best dishwasher results. Water should be 120 degrees before it enters the dishwasher. This is the new standards that we have to have out. So not only is it cost more to run, Ms. Noll, now we're wasting water, which this is a big issue nowadays. We always talk about water savings, especially let's go to California. Let's talk.
Without objections, and concerns that